So Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. Yes. And there was a ground-shaking earthquake, and Mary Magdalene and the other Mary ran to the tomb to tell the other disciple, and Jesus popped out of nowhere on the road and said, "Greetings." Oh, wait, that's what Matthew's gospel says. We'll try again. For terror and amazement seized them. Yes, and the woman remembered the words Jesus had told them, that he would rise on the third day. So they went to tell the other disciples, but guess what? The other disciples just thought these women were gossiping and it was an idle tale, so they didn't believe them. But it sparked Peter's curiosity enough that he ran to the tomb for himself to see, and he was amazed. That's what Luke's gospel says. Third time's the charm. For terror and amazement seized them, yes. And Mary stood weeping outside of the tomb because Jesus was gone. And a nice gardener came to comfort her in her grief, and he said, "Mary." And the minute he said her name, she recognized him as Jesus, as her teacher, and they had this wonderful embrace. And Mary runs off to tell her friends about it and becomes the first woman preacher saying, "I have seen the Lord." That definitely sounds right. That's John's gospel. And, I have to admit, I've always been partial to John's gospel. That's a guy who knows how to tell a story. Mark. This is kind of the worst Easter ending ever. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing, for they were afraid. Come on, Mark. That's all you've got? You couldn't have done a little bit more research, found a few other folks to talk with, embellished the ending a bit? Were you worried about being accused of, presenting fake news? What's your issue here? Don't you know that this is the biggest event in the Bible? This story's not going to sell. Who was your editor anyway? Actually, Mark had a couple of editors way after he was done with the book. One of them you'll see in your Bible. It's called The Shorter Ending of Mark. And this editor came along and tacked on 2 extra sentences. One that says that the women actually went and told Peter what they said they would. And the other sentence says that, the message of Jesus was spread throughout the world. Well, another editor, maybe who wanted to one-up this first editor, came in a more investigative reporter style and thought they could do better by adding 10 more verses. You'll also find this in your Bible. This is called the longer ending of Mark. And in this version, Jesus does appear to Mary Magdalene, and she tells the others, but of course they don't listen. Then Jesus appears to 2 people walking along a road. They tell the others, but of course the people don't listen. Then Jesus tells all the 11 gathered together, and he kind of chastises them for not believing in him. But then he says, go ahead and carry out my message to the world anyway. You see, at least 2 people did not like the way that Mark ended the story. But maybe Mark was just telling it as it really was. On that very first morning, before all of those post-resurrection appearances started happening and stories started flying around, maybe like a good cold case detective, Mark was just going back to the original source material before all this other stuff started popping up. And when he does so, he kind of leaves us here just standing with these women as if we're holding these spices too by the tomb. Instead of sitting here in this beautifully adorned sanctuary holding these orders of worship instead. It's a very eerie ending, isn't it? It's much more like Good Friday than Easter. Let's modernize it a bit. Imagine that you showed up to church today thinking that it was yesterday, that it was Saturday, and you were in your comfortable clothes, maybe your yard clothes or what you wear when you run errands, certainly not in your Easter best. And you were thinking that you're just going to stop by the church briefly to go to the foot of the cross courtyard, which is our columbarium. You just want to stop for a few minutes to pay your respects to a friend of yours who you love dearly and who has recently died. You missed their interment service, and so you want to come by on your own and just see where he's laid to rest. As you're driving to church, you do think about the fact, wow, I wonder if the church is going to be unlocked, how I'm going to be able to get in. But you think, I won't worry about that, I'll just get there. And then as you pull into the parking lot, you see a surprise. The parking lot is full of cars. And you walk in and you see the lights on in the sanctuary and the organ and the brass and the choir, and they're all practicing and rehearsing, and people are in fellowship hall breaking a piñata. What is going on? You wonder, wait a second, what day is it? It is Saturday, isn't it? Maybe it is Sunday. You've been so much in your world of grief that, you can't tell one day from the other, and you might have gotten the days mixed up. And so you come in here and sit with the others, and you listen to a preacher stand up and tell you that your friend has risen, that life has defeated death, that hope abounds, and all is well, except you turn around and look to where your friend sits in his pew, and he's not there. You're really confused. None of it makes sense. And you start thinking, wait a second, does this mean that my friend's cremains are not in the foot of the cross courtyard? So you rush out to the courtyard, and there's a nice messenger there, probably Corey Doty or one of her crew, and she tells you it's all okay, that you can go on home and tell your friends that this friend who you were mourning, that he has risen, that he is not there. In fact, they're taking the faceplate, the nameplate off of the niche, and she shows you the empty niche. He is alive. I wouldn't be doing this if he was still in there. Trust me, he is gone. And in fact, you can just drive on up to Boulder. He's waiting there to meet you at the place where you used to hang out. How would you react to such an experience? Would you know how to sort fact from fiction? Wouldn't you kind of be terrified and amazed too? Would you think you were dreaming or maybe crazy, or if you weren't crazy, that everybody else was? Would you be ready to talk about what had just happened? You see, Mark's ending is starting to sound and look more and more realistic, isn't it, to how these women might have felt that first morning. But people didn't want to leave it that way. They wanted to finish the story. They didn't like leaving the uncertainty unresolved. Now, scholars will tell you that these two endings of Mark are clearly not Mark's. They're not in his style of writing. They came way after. In fact, all the early manuscripts that we have of Mark end at verse 8. And it does feel anticlimactic the way he ended it. There's no denying it. And yet, Mark's version of the story is the resurrection good news too. It's just not scripted out for us like in the other Gospels. We have to work a little harder to find it. But the good news is here. If you've been worshiping with us all year, you know that we have been playing around with this theme of improv comedy, the first principle of improv comedy, that is yes and. That is, when you're on stage, you say yes to whatever situation is presented, you accept it as it is, and then you say and add on another line or another action so that you keep the story flowing and unfolding. And it's a great principle for the stage, also for life, because it keeps you constantly adapting to whatever is presented. And whatever is presented is seen as something that you can adapt to, no matter how improbable or incredible it is. Yes, and keeps us from getting stuck in life, because it reminds us that the only way we can stay unstuck is that we need other people with us on the stage. We need other people helping us with the story to unfold, and we must be open to whatever may come. No matter how unbelievable or inexplicable, it teaches us to roll with the punches and see where something takes us, rather than assuming that we already know. If any one of our gospel writers could be seen as an improv writer, it might be Mark. He is the one that keeps us clipping along at a fast pace. His is the shortest gospel. He's the one that's always saying immediately Jesus did this, and then immediately they went there. And even in this very last scene, he sets up this stage for us where we get to be improv players too. I can imagine if these women were acting out this scene, if you will. They're walking along with their spices early in the morning, thinking that they're going to Jesus' tomb, going to roll away this big stone, and then they think, gosh, we're not strong enough to roll away this stone. They know that another actor is going to be coming on stage, and in their minds, they've kind of played out the scene. Okay, so this guy's going to walk up, and he's going to help us unroll the stone. The only thing is, as they walk up to the tomb, their fellow actor, the one who they thought was going to behave in one way, all of a sudden throws a wrench in things. He jumps inside the tomb and says, guess what? He is not here. He is risen. He totally flips the script on them. And he goes into this monologue, essentially, don't be afraid. Jesus is now in Nazareth. He's back in Galilee. He's been raised. And the women are speechless. We never hear them say a word as he continues to talk. They do finally move, they flee, but they flee in terror and amazement. And all we know is that at least for that immediate moment, they didn't say a word to anyone. They seemingly just walked off stage, leaving us with their fear to kind of settle in. The scene did not unfold as they expected, not at all, and they froze. Now, this is what happens to us in life, I think, when something unexpected happens, right? We freeze, we get scared, we get speechless, we might be amazed. It's what the world did as the Cathedral of Notre Dame began to blaze in front of our eyes. People froze in front of the cathedral. Maybe they held up their phone to get it on video, or maybe we who are halfway around the world kept checking our phone as the story unfolded to see what was happening. Rita and Brad Berglund were in Paris on the day of the fire, and yesterday Brad was showing me these pictures he took of the cathedral the morning before it burned, spire and all. It was beautiful. And then on a river cruise that night, they were going down the river and could see the fire in the distance. Totally unexpected. Sometimes when we are going about our life and unexpected things happen, we're amazed, aren't we? And we're afraid. Who would have thought that this cathedral, after surviving 2 world wars, would burn during a restoration project of all things? The same way that who would have thought, as people living in Paris, that they would be on the streets, or that they would be homeless, or that they would be living pay to paycheck, their lives continually crumbling around them and seemingly no one helping or listening. The same way none of us thinks that we're going to be the ones who get blood work that comes back with uncertain results. The same way that none of us thinks that we're going to be the ones to get that phone call in the middle of the night or the knock on the door. The same way that none of us thinks that we're the ones that will be depressed. Our life isn't that bad, right? The same way that none of us thinks that our partner would be the one to lie to us or cheat on us, or that our child would be the one to make that decision. The same way that none of us thinks we're going to be the ones not to get the job, to be unemployed. The same way that none of us thinks that fill in your own blank. But these things do happen to us, don't they? Whatever it is for you, and when our world seems to be crumbling and crashing and burning before our eyes, whether it's a beloved building burning or beloved children of God dying, we are often captivated by fear and uncertainty. And we don't know what comes next or what foot to put in front of the other. And for a while, we may just watch, stunned. It seems that this is what's happening with the Marys and with Salome. Even in the face of what we now call good news, it was still shocking to them. But fear is never the last word, is it? The fear and silence of these women may have been the last words on the page, but it wasn't the last word of their witness. Because look, we found out about this story somehow, right? Eventually they talked, and it wasn't the last word of the gospel. Why? Because Jesus is already out ahead of us. Did you catch that in the story when the messenger in the tomb says, Jesus is in Galilee, you will find him there. Jesus is not locked up still in fear. He has conquered death, overcome despair. And he's not throwing a resurrection party, is he? He's not marching up to Pilate's place to rub it in his face that his little crucifixion plot didn't work. Oh, it killed him, all right. It worked in that sense, but it did not kill the gospel, because nothing can kill the good news of God's kingdom. That's what Jesus came to proclaim in his life, and that's what his resurrection proclaims as well, that God's love is the heartbeat that will keep beating and keep this world alive, even when we are beating the world and all the people in it, including ourselves, to death. Nothing can stop God's heart. Nothing can stop that love, not even death. And so it's that heartbeat in Jesus when he arises that takes him to Galilee. Galilee, the place where his ministry began. Galilee, the place where he healed people and taught and prayed and worked miracles. How does Jesus celebrate his resurrection? By getting right back to work. By restoring life and dignity to those who feel like their lives are crashing and burning. Did you know that the word resurrection in Mark that the gospel writer uses here is a Greek word, agiro. And Mark only uses it 6 other times before this one. And it literally means to arouse, to cause to rise, to awake, even from the sleep of death. It means to cause to rise up from a seat or from a bed or from a place of inaction. And in the 6 times that he uses this word, all 6 times are social resurrections of sorts. When Jesus raises someone out of a state, he raises them out of a state of being socially dead, not being able to participate in the life of the community. As one scholar put it, resurrection, while an eternal promise, is also a social reality in our midst. So Mark uses this word when he describes how Jesus helped Simon's mother-in-law get rid of the fever that she had so she could get up and be a part of the community again. The same word is used when a man who was paralyzed is lowered through a roof by his friends and Jesus heals him and he's able to get up and walk and live his life again. The same word is used when Jesus heals a man's shriveled hand on the Sabbath, showing that human restoration is more important than human rules. The same word is used when a 12-year-old girl, the daughter of an esteemed leader, is presumed to be dead, and Jesus says, Talitha cum, get up and walk, little girl. The same word is used when Jesus casts out spirit from a boy that is tormented, mentally and physically healing him, possessed no more. And the same word is used when Jesus heals Bartimaeus in Jericho, not only restoring physical sight to him, but allowing him to have acceptance of the community because he could go back into the temple and he no longer had to beg on the streets. While the resurrection of Jesus has eternal implications for sure and universal implications, the power of the resurrection always happens in our own contexts and our own lives. This is where the good news is for us today. And that's why Jesus gets up and goes back to Galilee. The story is circular. Go back to Galilee, begin again, rise up, follow me. See, Mark's story invites us to stand where those first trembling witnesses stood. Their fear, their amazement, their silence. It brings us as readers and hearers to our own thresholds of faith, to our own limits of the words that we often don't have to speak to the unspeakable, to the limits of our own human experience, to trust who or what is beyond what we call life. In our foremothers' silence, this story calls us, who are the disciples of the next generation, to speak for ourselves and to bring the gospel into dialogue with our lives. You see, it's not our job to put words in these women's mouths. It's our job to speak our own words, our own story of how the resurrection is true for us today. How do we find the good news when it's not scripted for us? When life is more mystery than certainty? Well, we stand at the tomb and we listen to these words. He has been raised up. Christ is risen. And we listen to that proclamation. And we stand there and we keep listening to it until we can say yes. And as soon as we can say yes, we say, and? The story is ours to finish. Amen.